In the bitter winter of 1891, deep in the windswept plains of Dakota Territory, a woman was doing something that no one in the surrounding settlements had ever seen before. She was digging. Not a root cellar, not a well, not the kind of shallow trench a man might cut to lay a fence post or bury a dead calf before the smell carried. She was digging a tunnel. A long, deliberate underground passage that began beneath the floor of her barn, curved beneath the frozen earth toward the grain silo, standing some 40 strides away, and from there bent again in the direction of her house. And the people who passed by on the road that ran not far from her homestead, the ones who caught a glimpse of the mounded earth and the timbers being lowered into the ground, they shook their heads and said what everyone in those parts seemed to say eventually, that Margaret Harwell had finally lost her senses entirely. They called her Maggie, though she had never invited anyone to do so. The name had simply attached itself to her the way names do in small communities, where familiarity is assumed whether it has been earned or not. She was 62 years old that autumn, and her hands showed every one of those years. Not soft hands, not the hands of a woman who had spent her life indoors, though she had spent a fair portion of it that way once. These were hands that had been remade by the prairie, thickened and cracked and permanently darkened in the creases by soil that no amount of washing could fully remove. She had come to Dakota Territory 7 years before in the spring of 1884 with her husband Roy and their only son Thomas. Thomas had been 23 that year, already married and already a father twice over, and it had been Thomas, not Roy, who had carried the real enthusiasm for the move west. He had read about it in the newspapers back in Ohio, the promises of land and possibility, the language of fresh starts in open country that the railroad companies and the government used to draw people toward a horizon they had never seen. Thomas had believed every word of it the way young men believe things that older people have learned to read more carefully, and his belief had been infectious enough to move the entire family 1,000 miles from everything they knew. Roy had gone along with it the way he went along with most things in those later years, with a kind of quiet agreement that could have been either trust or exhaustion, and Maggie had never been entirely sure which. Roy had been a carpenter in Ohio, a good one, a man whose hands understood wood the way some men's hands understand horses instinctively and without wasted motion. But the years had worn something down in him, some essential spring of initiative that had once made him the kind of man who started projects and finished them and started more. By the time Thomas began talking about Dakota Territory, Roy was 53 years old and no longer starting much of anything. He listened to his son's plans with a patience that looked like agreement, and when the family packed up and headed west, he went because not going would have required a kind of energy he no longer possessed. They had claimed their parcel of land under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of grass and sky and wind, and they had set about the work of breaking it. Thomas had thrown himself into it with the energy of a young man who believes that effort and outcome are directly connected, that if you simply work hard enough, the land will respond in kind. He had been wrong about that, but he had not lived long enough to learn it slowly the way most homesteaders did. Thomas died in the autumn of 1886, 2.5 years after the family arrived. A draft horse newly purchased and not yet fully broken had kicked him in the chest while he was adjusting a harness in the barn. It was the kind of accident that happened on homesteads with a frequency that people accepted the way they accepted weather, as a feature of the life rather than a flaw in it. Horses kicked. Men stood too close. The margin between a bruise and a death was measured in inches and angles, and Thomas had been on the wrong side of both. He had walked himself back to the house, which was the part of it that stayed with Maggie longest afterward. He had not fallen. He had not called out. He had put his hand against his chest and walked across the yard and up the steps and through the door and sat down in a chair by the stove. And he had looked at his mother with an expression she would carry for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who knows something is wrong, but has not yet accepted the full dimensions of what that something is. Something feels wrong inside, he said. He died before sundown. He was 25 years old. His daughter Clara was 6. His son Samuel was not yet 1. There are losses that a person absorbs and losses that a person is absorbed by, and the death of Thomas Harwell was the second kind for everyone it touched. Roy, who had never been a man of large emotions, went somewhere inside himself that autumn and did not come back. He began drinking not dramatically, not in the way of men who make their suffering visible to the world, but steadily, quietly, the way a foundation settles before a wall cracks. He stopped working the land with any real intention. He stopped speaking to Maggie about anything that mattered. He stopped picking up Samuel when the boy cried. He sat in the chair where Thomas had sat, and he looked at the stove, and he drank from a bottle he kept beside the woodpile, and Maggie watched him do it, and understood that she was watching a man follow his son into the ground by a slower and more deliberate route. The carpenter's hands that had once shaped wood with such precision began to shake. The shoulders that had carried lumber and lifted beams began to round and fold inward, as if Roy were trying to make himself smaller, to occupy less space in a world that had taken the one thing he had been willing to cross 1,000 miles to protect. He did not speak of Thomas. He did not visit the grave. He sat and he drank and he diminished, and the farm fell to Maggie, by default the way responsibilities fall to whoever is still standing when everyone else has sat down. By the time Roy died in the spring of 1888 from pneumonia, that a stronger man might have survived. Maggie understood that she had already been alone for some time. His death simply made the arrangement official. She was 59 years old. She had two grandchildren who had lost their father and now their grandfather, a parcel of land that was barely broke, a barn that still smelled of green lumber, and a winter coming that she had not yet faced without at least one other adult in the house. There was a moment in those first weeks after Roy was buried beside Thomas on the north side of the property when she considered leaving. Packing what could be packed, selling the livestock for whatever she could get, and taking Claire and Samuel back to Ohio where she had people, where she had once been a school teacher, where the winters were something a person endured rather than something a person survived. She stood at the two graves one evening in late April, the grass just beginning to green around the markers, and she thought about what leaving would mean. It would mean the land going back to whoever wanted to file on it next. It would mean the barn Thomas had built with his own hands, standing empty, then falling, then becoming one more skeleton of failed ambition on a prairie littered with them. It would mean the graves going untended, unmarked, forgotten within a generation. Thomas and Roy dissolving into the anonymous dead of a territory that consumed people the way fire consumes kindling, quickly and without keeping any record of what it had burned. She did not leave. The reasons were practical, and they were not. The practical reasons involved money she did not have for the journeyland, she could not sell quickly, and the knowledge that her people in Ohio were not the kind of people who could absorb two additional children without strain. Her sister had her own family, her own struggles, her own house that was already full. Going back would have meant becoming a burden, and Maggie had spent 60 years on Earth without being a burden to anyone and did not intend to start. The reasons that were not practical involved Thomas. He was buried on the north side of the property under a marker Roy had carved before the drinking took his hands, and Maggie could not bring herself to leave him there alone in the grass, with no one to know where he was. It was not a rational thing. She knew that. The dead do not know whether they are visited. The dead do not care whether the grass around their marker is trimmed or wild. But she was not making a rational decision. She was making the only decision she could live with, which is a different thing entirely. So she stayed. And because she stayed, she had to survive. And because she had to survive, she began to pay attention to everything around her in a way she had not done before, with the particular intensity of a woman who understands that no one is coming to help. She kept a journal, a small leather-bound book that she had brought from Ohio, originally intended for household accounts, and the occasional personal reflection. It became something else after Thomas died. She wrote in it every evening by the light of the oil lamp after Clara and Samuel were asleep. She wrote observations about the weather, about the behavior of the animals, about the condition of the soil. She wrote down how many times she opened the front door each day and how long it took the house to recover its warmth after each opening. She noted the temperature of the root cellar versus the temperature of the barn versus the temperature of the house versus the temperature outside. And she wrote letters to Thomas, short ones usually, a few lines at the end of an entry. She did not think of this as strange or sentimental. She thought of it as continuing a conversation that had been interrupted, one she was not ready to let go of. Perhaps would never be ready. The cows are doing better than I expected. Clara has your stubbornness, which I say as a compliment. Samuel coughed again last night. I counted my steps to the barn this morning. 47 seconds in this cold. That is 47 seconds too many. The nearest neighbor of any consequence was a man named Cyrus Fenton, who ran a proper cattle operation about 2 miles to the north as the crow flies. A full morning's walk in good weather, something close to an ordeal in the kind of cold that Dakota Territory could produce. Cyrus was a man of about 50, built solid and weathered in the way of men who have spent their lives doing work that does not forgive softness. He was competent. He was reliable. He was, in his own estimation, the unofficial center of the small constellation of homesteads that formed the only community any of them had. He had taken it upon himself to check on Maggie after Roy died, writing down once a month or so to see if she needed anything, which she usually did but rarely admitted. It was the kind of neighborliness that the frontier produced, genuine in its concern, but also carrying a faint undercurrent of propriety, the help of a man who wants you to understand that you are being helped and that the helping reflects well on the helper. Maggie accepted it with gratitude and without illusion. She knew what Cyrus thought of her. He thought she was a capable woman in an impossible situation, and he was waiting with the patience of a man who has seen it before for the situation to prove itself more powerful than the capability. He was also a man who believed deeply in the way things had always been done, not out of laziness or stupidity, but out of the genuine conviction that the old ways had been tested by time and found sufficient. His father had ranched in Illinois. His grandfather had ranched before that. The methods passed down through those generations were to Cyrus not merely habits, but a kind of inherited wisdom that newcomers dismissed at their peril. You built your barn solid. You chinked your walls. You went out to your animals in the cold because that was what you did. You endured. That was the word Cyrus used most often when he spoke of winter, a word that carried for him the weight of a philosophy. You endured because enduring was what people like them did, and if you could not endure, you had no business being on the plains in the first place. Beyond Cyrus, perhaps another mile and a half in the same general direction, lived the Halverson family. Recent arrivals from Minnesota who were still in the process of figuring out what they had gotten themselves into. The father was a quiet man named Henrik, who spoke mostly in Norwegian to his wife and mostly in English to everyone else, and whose English carried the particular careful quality of a language learned in adulthood, each word placed with deliberation like stones being set in a wall. The older son, a young man of about 20 named Eric, had the particular confidence of youth that has not yet encountered a problem it cannot solve, and the particular blindness that comes with it. Eric could shoe a horseman a fence and butcher a hog before most men his age had finished their breakfast, and he carried these competencies like credentials, displaying them casually and often, the way a man with a new watch checks the time more frequently than necessary. To the south, closer to 3 miles distant, a widow named Gertrude Blanchard ran a small sheep operation with the help of her grown son. Gertrude was older than Maggie by several years, and she carried her age like a credential of a different kind. She had survived more hard winters than anyone in the area, first in Minnesota and now here, and she had survived them the way everyone survived them, by doing what had always been done. To Gertrude, that history of survival was proof that the methods were sound. She had buried a husband and raised a son and kept her sheep alive through blizzards that killed stronger operations, and she had done it all without tunnels or innovations or ideas that required explanation. The possibility that the methods could be improved was not something she spent time considering. Why would she? They had worked. She was alive. The sheep were alive. What more proof did a person need? These were the people who formed Maggie's world. Not a town. Not a community in any organized sense. Just scattered homesteads separated by enough empty country to make every winter feel like something you had to survive alone. And the winters. Anyone who speaks of that period of Dakota Territory history and does not speak first and longest about the winters is not speaking truthfully. The cold that descended on those plains between November and March was a different kind of cold than most people experience in a lifetime. It was cold that worked its way through every gap in a wall, cold that made the wood of a house contract and groan in the night like something living, something restless, something that wanted to be somewhere else. Cold that could take a person from healthy to frostbitten in the time it took to cross from the front door to the woodpile. The animals suffered for it, and the suffering of animals was not a matter of sentiment on the frontier. It was a matter of economics, of survival, of whether a family would have milk and meat and draft animals come spring. Livestock that got too cold stopped producing. Livestock that got much too cold simply died. And when livestock died in February, the people who depended on them faced a kind of reckoning that could not be solved until the ground thawed enough to start over. A dead milk cow in February meant no milk until you could buy or trade for another one, which might not be until summer, which meant months of doing it without, which meant children growing thinner and adults growing weaker, and the whole enterprise of homesteading sliding a little closer to the edge of something that could not be recovered from. Every homesteader in those parts dealt with this the same way. You built your barn as solid as you could manage. You chinked the walls with whatever you had, mud, straw, strips of hide, and you prayed that it would be enough. When the temperature dropped low enough that the animals needed more care, you went out to them. 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day in the worst of it. You wrapped yourself in every layer you owned, leaned into the wind, and made the trip from house to barn and back again. It was understood that this was simply how things were. It had always been how things were. Cyrus Fenton's father had done it that way, and his father, before him back in Illinois, before the family came west. Gertrude Blanchard had done it that way for 20 years in Minnesota and saw no reason to do it differently here. Eric Halverson did it that way because it was the only way he had ever seen it done, and he was not yet old enough to question the things he had always seen. But in the autumn of 1888, during her first full winter on the property, without Roy, something happened that lodged itself in Maggie's mind and would not leave. It was November. A cold snap had come early. Not the real winter yet, but a preview of it, the kind of cold that makes you check your preparations and find them wanting. She had gone down into the root cellar beneath the house to retrieve a jar of preserved beans, and she had stopped there on the bottom step. She stood in the dim light with the box in her hand, and she felt it. The air underground was a different thing entirely than the air above. Not warm exactly, but not biting. Stable. The kind of air that did not try to take something from you every time you breathed it in. She held her hand out in front of her and felt the stillness of it, the way the temperature simply held neither rising nor falling, while above her the world was being stripped raw by wind. She thought about her animals on one end of the property and her house on the other end, with all that frozen ground lying between them, and something shifted in her understanding of what was possible. She heard Thomas's voice in her memory clear as the day he had said it, standing in this very root cellar the previous summer, laughing at the coolness of it while the sun blazed outside. The ground knows something we do not, he had said, or something close to it. Prairie dogs have the right idea. We are the fools building everything up in the wind. He had been joking. She was not. She did not act on it immediately. She was not a woman who moved on impulse, and the idea was large enough that it needed time to take its shape. She spent the rest of that winter observing, making notes in her journal with the methodical attention of a woman who had spent 11 years teaching children to read and write, who understood that knowledge is built not through grand revelation, but through the patient accumulation of small, careful observations, recorded honestly and reviewed without prejudice. She noticed how long it took her body to recover after each trip to the barn, the aching in her joints that took longer to fade each year, the way her fingers felt wooden and distant for 20 minutes after she came back inside and stood by the stove flexing them until the feeling returned. She noted the way Samuel, not yet 3, would cough for an hour after she brought him out into the cold to accompany her because she could not leave him alone in the house. The cough was a wet, rattling thing that came from somewhere deep in his small chest, and it frightened her in a way she did not write about in the journal because writing about fear made it more real. She watched Cyrus Fenton lose 2 hogs in January to what he called the chill, and she thought about what that meant for his family come fall. She watched the Halverson boy ride past her property with his collar pulled up to his eyes and his horse's breath coming in white bursts that the wind snatched away before they had fully formed. She watched Gertrude Blanchard's son trudge through the snow to their barn, bent against the wind like a man walking into a wall. And she thought about how many thousands of times he had made that walk, and how many thousands of times he would make it again, and how no one had ever stopped to ask whether it was necessary. She watched the snow pile against the north wall of her barn and saw that even in the worst cold, the base of that wall, where the earth met the wood, was never as frosted as the upper sections. The ground was doing something. The ground was holding something. And every night she went down to the root cellar and felt that holding, that patience, that quiet refusal to participate in the violence of the air above. She observed through the winter of 1889 and the winter of 1890 as well. 3 winters of watching, 3 winters of notes, 3 winters of stepping out into cold that seemed to grow harder each year as her body grew older. She was 60 now and then 61, and she could feel the difference in her knees when she climbed the steps from the root cellar in her back, when she lifted a feed bucket, in the way her breath came shorter on the coldest mornings, not from exertion, but from the simple shock of air that was too cold for an aging body to process without complaint. She was not getting stronger. The winters were not getting milder. The math of it led in only one direction. By the following autumn, the autumn of 1891, she had made up her mind. She told Cyrus Fenton about her plan when he came by to help her with a section of fencing that had come down in a summer storm. It was one of those rare acts of neighborly assistance that Cyrus performed with a generosity that was genuine but also slightly proprietary, the help of a man who wants you to understand that you are being helped. She appreciated it regardless. She needed the fencing done, and she could not do it alone, and pride was a luxury she could not afford. Not at 62, not with 2 children to feed and a winter to prepare for. When the work was finished and he was standing by his horse drinking water from a jar she had brought out, she explained it as carefully as she could. The tunnel from barn to silo to house, all running beneath the frost line, all connected so that on the worst days of winter, she could move between her buildings without ever stepping above ground, and so that the relative warmth of the underground passage might ease the temperature swings that her animals and her family endured all season long. She had rehearsed the explanation in her mind for weeks, turning the words over the way she had once turned lesson plans, looking for the clearest way to say what she meant, so that a man like Cyrus, who thought in practical terms and distrusted anything that sounded theoretical, would hear the sense of it before his skepticism had time to build its walls. Cyrus listened with the patience of a man who has decided not to argue with a woman he respects, but also cannot quite believe what he is hearing. He was leaning against his horse while she spoke, and she watched his expression move through several stages. Interest, then confusion, then something that settled into a kind of careful concern, the way a doctor's expression settles when a patient describes symptoms that point towards something the doctor would rather not name. When she finished, he looked at the ground for a moment. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other. He glanced at the barn and then at the house and then at the space between them, as if measuring the distance with his eyes and calculating the labor that her plan would require. Then he said, in the careful way of a man choosing his words, that it seemed like a considerable amount of work for something that might not hold up through the freeze and thaw cycle, and that if she was set on it, he hoped she knew what she was getting into. He said it with kindness. He said it the way a person says something when they believe they are being gentle with someone who is making a mistake. What he meant and what he told the Halversons the following week without the careful words was that he thought she had lost her measure of good sense, that someone ought to keep an eye on her come spring, that a woman her age alone with 2 small children ought to be thinking about practical matters rather than digging holes in the ground like some kind of burrowing animal. He used that word, burrowing. He said it to Henrik Halverson while they were mending a shared fence line, and Henrik had nodded in the slow way. He nodded at most things and said nothing, and Eric, who was holding the fence wire taut, had grinned. The Halversons were less diplomatic about it when they encountered Maggie directly. Eric, the older boy, rode past her property one afternoon while she was marking out the path of the first section with stakes and twine. He pulled his horse up and looked at what she was doing for a long time before he asked. When she told him, he laughed. Not cruelly, but the way a person laughs at something genuinely baffling, something so far outside the range of expected behavior that humor is the only available response. He said he had heard of a lot of ways to waste a good autumn, but this one was new to him. He said it with a grin that he probably thought was friendly, the grin of a young man who does not yet understand that friendliness and condescension can wear the same face. Maggie watched him ride away and said nothing. She had taught school for 11 years in Ohio before her marriage, and she had learned in those years that there is no argument you can make to a 20-year-old boy who has already decided you are foolish. You simply have to wait for the world to make the argument for you. The world is better at it than you are, and it does not care whether the boy finds it friendly. The story spread. As stories spread in isolated communities where people are hungry for anything worth talking about, where the arrival of a new piece of gossip is treated with the same enthusiasm that people in towns reserve for new shops or new entertainments. By the end of the week, everyone within riding distance knew that the Harwell widow was planning to dig tunnels under her farm, and everyone had an opinion about it, and none of the opinions were favorable. Gertrude Blancher sent her son over with a polite note, suggesting that Maggie might benefit from some assistance thinking through her plans. The note was kind in its way. Gertrude had written it in her careful hand, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write late and never quite trusted her letters to look the way she wanted them to, and she had included a jar of blackberry preserves as if to soften what she knew the words carried. But the message underneath the kindness was the same one Cyrus had delivered in his careful words and Eric Halverson had delivered in his laughter. She was wrong. She was wasting her time and her resources. The way things had always been done was the way things were done for good reasons. Reasons that people like her newcomers, school teachers from Ohio women past 60 who ought to know better, did not yet fully understand. Maggie read the note that evening after the children were in bed. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and Gertrude's careful handwriting in front of her, and she felt the weight of it. Not anger, something heavier than anger. The particular exhaustion of being dismissed by people who have not taken the time to understand what you are telling them. She had felt it before in Ohio in the schoolhouse when she had tried to introduce new methods of teaching reading and had been told by the school board, 5 men who had not been inside a classroom since they were 12, that the old methods were fine and that she ought not to trouble herself with improvements. She looked at Clara and Samuel sleeping in the narrow bed against the far wall. Clara was 11 now, tall for her age, with Thomas's jaw and Thomas's way of tilting her head when she was listening hard, as if she could hear better from one angle than another. Samuel was 5, small and serious, and given to coughing fits that started in November and did not fully stop until April. He slept with one hand curled under his chin, the way Thomas had slept as a child, and looking at that hand, those small fingers tucked against that small face, Maggie felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with purpose. She thought about what she was afraid of. She was not afraid of being wrong. She had 3 years of observations in her journal, and the observations were clear, and she trusted them. She was afraid of time. She was 62 years old. Her knees ached in the cold. Her back seized up on the worst mornings so badly that she had to stand braced against the kitchen table for several minutes before she could straighten her fingers white against the wood, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts while she waited for the muscles to release their grip. Her hands, which had once been steady enough to write a clean line on a chalkboard from one side to the other, now trembled when she was tired, which was most of the time. Her hips had started to catch when she climbed the steps to the porch, a small hesitation in the joint that she recognized as the beginning of something that would only get worse. How many more winters could she make the trip from house to barn 5 times a day? How many more winters before she slipped on the ice, before the cold caught her? Between buildings, before her body simply refused to do what the land demanded of it. And when that day came, when she fell on the frozen ground between the house and the barn and could not get up, what happened to Clara and Samuel, who fed them, who kept the stove burning, who walked out into the cold to tend the animals that kept them all alive? She opened her journal and wrote not an observation but a truth she had not spoken aloud to anyone. I am not building this for this winter. I am building this for the winter when I am no longer strong enough to walk outside. I am building this because I will not leave these children the way Thomas left them, not if there is something I can do. She wrote a short line to Thomas beneath it. Your prairie dogs. You were right. Then she thanked Gertrude's son for bringing the note, set the jar of preserves on the shelf, and went back to her digging. She began in the first week of October before the ground hardened beyond working. She rose before dawn, fed the children, sent Clara to the subscription school 4 miles away with Samuel in tow, and then she walked to the barn and picked up her mattock and her spade, and she dug. The work was something beyond hard. She was digging through soil that was packed tight from years of frost and thaw, laced through with the roots of prairie grass that had been growing undisturbed for longer than anyone in the territory could say. Her hands blistered within the first few days, and then the blisters broke, and then they reformed and broke again, and eventually the skin beneath them hardened into something that was no longer quite skin, but something tougher, something that belonged to the work itself. Her back screamed at her. Her knees swelled by mid-afternoon and did not return to their normal size until she had slept. Every morning she woke up stiff. Every evening she went to bed aching, and in between she dug. She dug with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent 11 years teaching children to read, who understood that large tasks are accomplished not through bursts of enthusiasm, but through the relentless repetition of small efforts day after day until the thing is done. She had learned that lesson in her first year of teaching, standing in front of a classroom of 8-year-olds who could not tell a B from a D, and who looked at the printed page the way a person looks at a foreign country, with incomprehension and a faint suspicion that the whole thing might be a trick. You did not teach them to read in a day or a week or a month. You taught them one letter at a time, one sound at a time, one word at a time, and you did it again the next day and the next, and eventually the letters stopped being strangers and became friends, and the words stopped being puzzles and became meaning, and the children who had looked at you with incomprehension looked at you with understanding, and you moved on to the next child and started again. Digging a tunnel was the same work. One spadeful at a time, one section at a time. The patience of a teacher apply to a different kind of lesson taught not to children but to the ground. Clara helped when she was home from school. The girl was strong for her age and she understood without being told that her grandmother had a purpose worth helping with. She did not ask why. She did not ask if the neighbors were right. She picked up the smaller spade and she dug alongside Maggie in a silence that was not empty but full, the silence of two people engaged in the same work for the same reasons. Samuel carried water. He was 5 years old and the bucket was too heavy for him, so he filled it halfway and made twice as many trips, and he did not complain. And Maggie loved him for it with a fierceness that sometimes stopped her mid-swing with the mattock, because he looked so much like Thomas at that age that the resemblance was a physical thing, a pressure in her chest that she had to breathe through before she could continue. The dirt piled up along the sides of the trench in long, low mounds that she knew would draw more comments from anyone who passed on the road. She did not care. She had passed through carrying somewhere around the third day of digging, when the blisters had broken for the second time, and she had wrapped her hands in strips of cloth and picked up the mattock again and understood that she was going to finish this thing regardless of what anyone said or thought or whispered about her when she was not present to hear it. She was building something. She was building it alone. And when the winter came, it would either work or it would not, and no amount of opinion from Cyrus Fenton or Eric Halverson or Gertrude Blanchard would change what the ground did or did not do. The ground would decide. The ground always decided. That was the one thing Maggie Harwell had learned in 7 years on the Dakota prairie that she trusted completely. People had opinions, the ground had facts, and she was digging her way down to them. The section from barn to silo she tackled first because it was the shorter run roughly 40 strides above ground, and because she understood with the instinct of a woman who had taught herself everything she knew about this land that you do not begin with the hardest part. You begin with the part that teaches you how to do the hard part. She had watched enough children learn enough difficult things to know that confidence is built in sequence, that the student who masters the small problem first approaches the large problem with a different posture than the one who starts with the large problem and fails. She was her own student now, and she intended to teach herself properly. The trench ran about the width of 2 shoulders set side by side and deep enough that a person could move through it in a low crouch without their head scraping the top. She had measured this by having Clara walk through the first completed section, watching where the girl's head came in relation to the rough ceiling, and then adjusting the depth of the next section accordingly. Clara was tall for 11, but Maggie was not a large woman, and she calculated that what worked for Clara would work for her as well, with a few inches to spare. She wrote the measurements in her journal: 4 feet and 8 inches from floor to ceiling, 3 feet and 2 inches from wall to wall. Deep enough to be below the frost line, which she estimated at about 3.5 feet based on her observations of how deep the ground froze in the 2 previous winters. She used the timber she had stockpiled from a grove of cottonwood she had taken down the previous spring. It had been brutal work felling those trees alone with a cross-cut saw designed for 2 people, but she had done it because the wood was there, and she had known even then in some part of her mind that was already planning what her hands had not yet started, that she would need it. The logs were cut to lengths set as supports along the sides of the passage and laid across the top in a manner not unlike the construction of a mine shaft. Though Maggie had never been inside a mine and was working from nothing but observation and judgment and a stubbornness that the people around her mistook for something less useful than it was. She filled in above the timber roof with the earth she had excavated, packing it down with the flat of her spade until the passage was well buried, sealed against the air above, held in place by the weight of the ground itself. Then she moved on to the next section, and the next, and the next. The rhythm of the work became its own kind of sustenance. She woke each morning knowing exactly what she would do and exactly how she would do it, and there was a comfort in that certainty that she had not expected. The world above ground was full of variables she could not control: weather, neighbors, the health of her animals, the cough in Samuel's chest, the question of whether the money she had left would last until spring. But the trench was hers. The trench responded to effort in a way that was direct and honest and uncomplicated by anything except the hardness of the soil and the strength of her arms. October became November. The mornings grew colder and the days grew shorter, and the ground grew harder beneath her tools, resisting her in a way that felt almost personal, as if the earth itself had an opinion about what she was doing and wanted her to know it. She adjusted. She poured water on the soil the evening before she planned to dig a new section, letting it soak in overnight, softening the ground just enough to make the mattock bite. It was a small thing, a trick she had figured out by accident when she spilled a bucket near the trench one evening and noticed the difference the next morning. But small things were what this project was made of. 1,000 small things each one learned by doing, each one written down in the journal at night so she would not have to learn it again. She developed other techniques as well, the kind of knowledge that cannot be found in books because no one had ever thought to write it down. She learned that cutting the roots of the prairie grass was easier if she attacked them at an angle rather than straight on, letting the blade of the mattock slide along the root rather than trying to sever it in a single blow. She learned that the timbers held better if she notched them slightly where they met, creating a joint that resisted sideways pressure. She learned that the clay subsoil, which she hit at about 4 feet in most places, could be mixed with straw to make a sealant for the joints between timbers that was nearly as good as mortar and considerably easier to work with. Each of these discoveries went into the journal, not as theories or principles, but as practical notes, the kind of thing a carpenter might write in the margin of a plan. Use clay from below 4 feet mixed with straw for joints. Cut roots at angle not straight. Notch timbers where they meet. Wet the ground the night before digging. She was building not just a tunnel, but a manual for building tunnels, though she did not think of it that way at the time. She thought of it as simply keeping track. The silo connection presented its own problem. The stone base of the silo did not accommodate a passage easily. The stones had been laid by the previous owner of the property, a man whose name Maggie did not know, and who had left no other trace of himself on the land except this silo and a fence post with the initials J.R. carved into it, and they had been laid with the grim permanence of someone who intended the structure to outlast him, which it had. She spent the better part of a week solving that particular difficulty, trying one approach and then another, chiseling at the mortar between stones, repositioning timbers, stepping back and looking at the problem from a different angle, the way she had once stepped back from a difficult student and tried to see what she was missing. She found the solution on a Thursday morning, though she would not have been able to explain it to anyone in terms they would have understood. It involved removing 3 stones from the base without disturbing the ones above them, a piece of work that required patience and a kind of spatial reasoning that she had not known she possessed until she needed it. She braced the gap with doubled timbers and packed the joints with the clay and straw mixture she had developed, testing each joint with her fingers, pressing and probing until she was satisfied that nothing would shift. She tested the whole assembly by pushing against the frame with her full weight, which was not much, and then by having Clara push as well, and when it did not move, she moved on. Then came the long run to the house. This was the most ambitious section, the one that made the entire project either practical or pointless. The barn-to-silo passage was useful on its own and allowing her to move grain to the animals without going above ground. But it was the connection to the house that would change everything. It was the house connection that would eliminate those brutal crossings in January, the ones that took 47 seconds each way and left her gasping and stiff and diminished in ways that accumulated over the course of a winter, until by March she felt 10 years older than she had in October. She dug. She dug through soil that was harder now. November soil, soil that was beginning to set itself against the coming freeze. She dug past roots that her mattock bounced off of thick ancient things that belonged to grasses that had been growing on this land since before any European had set foot on it. She dug until her shoulders burned and her lower back locked up, and she had to stop and stand bent over with her hands on her knees, breathing, waiting for her body to agree to continue. There were moments when the body did not agree, moments when she stood bent over the trench and felt the muscles in her lower back seize into a knot that would not release, and she had to lower herself to the ground and lie flat on the cold earth with her knees drawn up until the spasm passed. She lay there looking at the sky, at the gray November clouds moving east in a procession that seemed to have no beginning and no end. And she thought about what Cyrus Fenton would say if he rode past and saw her lying in the dirt beside her trench, like a woman who had collapsed from work she had no business doing. She got up. She always got up. Getting up was not optional. Getting up was the price of the project and the price of the children sleeping in the house and the price of being 62 years old on a piece of land that did not care how old she was or how much her back hurt or whether she had anyone to help her. The land asked its questions and you answered them or you left, and she was not leaving. Clara dug beside her after school, silent and steady. Samuel sat at the edge of the trench and watched, his small face serious, his hands wrapped around a cup of water he had carried out from the house. Sometimes he talked to his grandmother while she worked. He told her about things he had seen: a bird, a cloud that looked like a horse, the way the frost made patterns on the window in the morning that he thought were maps of places that did not exist. Maggie listened to all of it. She listened to his voice the way you listen to water running over stones, for the sound of it, for the life in it, and she dug. Sometimes when Samuel talked, she heard Thomas in his voice. Not the words which were a 5-year-old's words, inconsequential and wonderful, but the cadence. The way he paused in the middle of a thought to look at something that had caught his attention, the way Thomas had paused, and then returned to the thought as if the interruption had not happened. She dug and she listened and she breathed through the tightness in her chest, and she did not cry, because crying required the use of muscles she needed for the mattock. It was during the long run to the house in the third week of November that Cyrus Fenton stopped on the road. Maggie was in the trench waist deep in earth, her face streaked with dirt and her hair coming loose from the cloth she had tied around it. She heard the horse before she saw him, the particular heavy rhythm of Cyrus's bay gelding, which she had learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize any repeating sound in a landscape where sounds are few. She straightened up and looked at him across the mounded earth. He was sitting in his saddle looking at the scale of the excavation. The trench stretched behind her all the way back to the silo, a long, raw wound in the earth that had already been partially filled and covered in the completed sections, and ahead of her toward the house where the stakes and twine marked the path of what remained to be dug. He looked at it for a long time. His face carried an expression she could not quite read from where she was standing. It was not the careful concern he had shown when she first told him. It was not the dismissal she had heard secondhand from the Halversons. It was something else, something that might have been recognition, or might have been discomfort, or might have been the particular look of a man who is watching someone do a thing he told them could not be done and is beginning to wonder if he was wrong. He did not offer to help. He tipped his hat, and he rode on. Maggie watched him go. She watched the horse carry him up the road until he was small against the horizon, and then she turned back to the trench and picked up her mattock and swung it into the earth with a force that surprised her, because she had not known until that moment how much she had wanted him to say something. Not praise, not encouragement, just acknowledgement. A question, a word that indicated he saw what she was doing and understood that it was not madness, but method, not desperation, but design. The silence he had offered instead sat in her chest like a stone, and she swung the mattock against it until the feeling passed, and then she kept digging, because that was what there was to do. She finished in early December, just before the first serious cold arrived. She had been working for close to 2 months, most of it alone. The tunnel ran the full circuit, barn to silo, silo to house, with a small earthen shelf she had built at the midpoint of each section where a lantern could be set. She had fashioned the interior entry point from the house through the back wall of the root cellar, cutting through the stone foundation in a manner similar to what she had done at the silo, bracing it with doubled timbers and sealing the gaps with clay. The evening she declared it finished, she lit a lantern and stood at the root cellar entrance, and looked into the passage she had built. The opening was dark beyond the reach of the flame, and the air that came out of it was still carrying the smell of turned earth and cottonwood and something else, something older, the smell of ground that had not seen light in a very long time. She stepped in. Clara followed behind her, carrying a second lantern, and the two of them walked the full length of the passage in silence. The ceiling was low enough that Maggie had to duck her head slightly, but not so low that it felt oppressive. The walls were close, but not crushing. The timber supports stood firm along both sides, and the packed earth above them held without a sound. And the air. The air inside that passage was exactly what she had stood in her root cellar and imagined 3 years earlier. Not warm the way a room with a fire is warm, but stable, protected, like the ground itself was wrapping around you and simply declining to let the cold in. She held her hand out in front of her and felt no wind, no bite, no movement at all, just stillness, just the quiet constancy of earth that holds its temperature through patience and mass, and the simple refusal to change quickly. Clara said something behind her, soft enough that Maggie almost missed it. It feels like being inside something alive. Maggie did not answer. She kept walking. She walked through the passage to the silo, and through the silo to the barn, and she stood there among her animals. The 2 milk cows, and the team of draft horses, and the small number of pigs, and the chickens, she kept in a partitioned corner, and she breathed the air that her tunnel had carried from the ground into this space, and she knew. She knew it worked. She knew it the way she had known on the bottom step of the root cellar 3 years ago, not through theory or argument, but through the feeling of it against her skin, the evidence of her own body standing in air that was not trying to kill her. She wrote in her journal that night the entry longer than most. Walked the full length this evening. The air is what I expected, what I hoped. Clara felt it too. The ground below the frost line holds a temperature that does not follow the air above. It stays the same the way a stone stays the same when the wind blows over it. The wind changes. The stone does not. The passage does not heat the barn. It does not need to. What it does is connect the barn to the house without breaking the seal of either one. No more opening doors to the cold 5 times a day. No more crossing that distance in the wind. The ground holds what the air will not. The community's reaction to the finished tunnel was, if anything, more skeptical than their reaction to the digging had been. At least the digging was an activity they could understand, even if they thought it misguided. Hard work was something everyone on the frontier respected, even when they disagreed with its application. But the tunnel itself was something different. It was underground, invisible, and therefore unverifiable to anyone who had not walked it themselves, which none of them had, because none of them had been invited, because Maggie had learned by then that invitations to see things people have already decided are foolish tend to produce nothing but more elaborate versions of the same foolishness they had already expressed. Cyrus Fenton told his wife that he had heard the Harwell woman had built herself some kind of burrow system like a prairie dog. And was that not something? His wife, whose name was Martha and whose opinions generally aligned with her husband's, though she expressed them less frequently, said she hoped the poor woman knew what she was about. Eric Halverson made a comment at the subscription school that Clara heard and did not repeat to her grandmother. Maggie never learned what it was. She could guess. She had been teaching long enough to know what young men say about old women they find ridiculous, and she had been alive long enough to know that the words were not worth the energy of caring about them. Gertrude Blanchard said with genuine worry in her voice that she hoped the roof of the thing would not come down on someone in the night. She said it to her son, who mentioned it to Eric Halverson, who mentioned it to Cyrus Fenton, who mentioned it to no one because by that point even Cyrus had grown tired of talking about it. The general verdict was that it was an interesting project for a widow with more energy than sense, and that come spring she would likely have a tunnel full of meltwater and a lesson learned the hard way. December came in cold but manageable, the kind of cold that is expected, prepared for, endured without incident. Maggie tended her animals through the tunnel and said nothing about it to anyone. January arrived and January began to bare its teeth. Maggie moved through her mornings differently now. She rose before full light the way she always had. She dressed in the dark the way she always had. She fed the stove, checked on Samuel, made sure Clara was stirring, and then she walked to the interior entry point she had built into the back of her root cellar, lit her lantern, and made her way through the passage to the barn. The air in the tunnel was nothing like the air outside. She did not need to wrap herself in layers to survive the passage. She carried a lantern and wore her regular house clothes, a wool dress and an apron, and the leather shoes she wore indoors, and she walked to her animals the way a person might walk down a hallway, down a corridor in a house, as if the barn were simply another room, which in a sense it now was. The livestock seemed calmer for it. The change was subtle at first, noticeable only to someone who was paying the kind of attention Maggie paid. Fewer abrupt intrusions of cold air when she arrived. The barn door stayed closed. The animals did not startle at the blast of winter that normally accompanied every human entrance. They simply looked up and saw her there, appearing as if from the wall itself, quiet and unhurried, and they went back to what they were doing. She began noticing that she was carrying smaller amounts of feed than she had expected to need. The animals were eating normally, but they were not burning through reserves the way they had in previous winters. In the 2 winters she had managed alone, she had watched her livestock grow lean and desperate by February, consuming everything she gave them, and still losing weight, still hollowing out around the ribs and haunches, because so much of what they ate was being converted not into muscle or milk or warmth, but into the raw fuel of survival. They were burning feed just to keep their bodies from shutting down. This winter was different. The cows continued to produce milk well into January, which they had not done either of the 2 previous years. The horses maintained their weight. The pigs, which were the most sensitive to temperature swings of any animal she kept, gained weight instead of losing it. She noticed the difference in her firewood consumption by the 2nd week of January. The house was still cold. It still required constant attention to the stove. That had not changed, and she had not expected it to change. But there was something about not having to open the main door half a dozen times a day in brutal cold that changed the character of the interior temperature in a way she could feel and measure. Every time a frontier door opened in January and shut again, the warm air that had taken hours to build up went out, and the cold air came flooding in. It was a cycle that repeated itself all day long, every day for months. Open, close, warm, cold. Build, lose. Build again, lose again. She had reduced those exchanges to almost nothing, and the difference in how much wood she was burning was visible to anyone who looked at her woodpile. She did not go to her neighbors and tell them this. She kept it in her journal and kept working. She wrote to Thomas that night. The entry was short. The animals hold. The woodpile holds. Everything you joked about was true. I wish you could see it. She tried to explain what she had built to Cyrus Fenton in early February when he stopped by, and she invited him in. It was a rare visit. Cyrus did not come to see her often, and when he did, it was usually because some piece of neighboring business required it, a fence line question, a stray animal, something practical. This time he had come because one of his cows had wandered south, and he thought it might have ended up on her property, which it had not. She made coffee. It was not good coffee. Coffee on the frontier was rarely good coffee, and hers was worse than most because she stretched the grounds further than they were meant to go. But it was hot, and hot mattered more than good in February in Dakota Territory. He sat at her table with the cup between his hands, and she told him what she had observed. She told him about the firewood, about the livestock, about the milk production, and the way the horses looked compared to the 2 previous winters. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she would have presented a lesson to a classroom of students. Here are the facts. Here is what they suggest. Here is what I believe they mean. She explained the principle as simply as she could. The ground below the frost line holds steady. It does not follow the air above. The tunnel connects the buildings without breaking the seal of either one. No doors opening to the wind, no cold air flooding in, no warm air flooding out. The animals spend their feed on growing instead of surviving. The house keeps its heat instead of losing it 6 times a day. She thought of it like the difference between a coat and bare skin. The coat does not produce heat. It holds what the body already has. The ground was doing the same thing for her buildings and her animals and her family. Cyrus listened. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and his full skepticism operating simultaneously, a man who respected her enough to hear her out and doubted her enough to question everything she said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. He said he was glad her animals were doing well. He said it with sincerity. He said nothing about trying it himself. She did not push him. But that night alone in his own house with Martha asleep beside him and the wind pressing against the walls with the steady, mindless force that Dakota wind has in February, Cyrus Fenton lay awake and thought about what Maggie Harwell had told him. He thought about his 2 hogs that had died the previous January. He thought about the calf he had lost just 3 weeks ago to the cold, the one he had found in the morning stuffed and frosted, its mother standing over it with an expression that he could not look at for very long, because it reminded him too much of things that animals are not supposed to remind you of. He thought about the woodpile behind his house and how much smaller it was than it should have been at this point in the season. He thought about Martha, who had been coughing since Christmas in a way that worried him more than he let on. He thought about the trip from house to barn that he made 4 times a day, the way the cold hit him each time like a punishment for something he had not done, the way his fingers ached for an hour afterward, the way his knees had started to betray him on the icy ground in a manner that was new this year and that he did not like to think about. And for the first time since Maggie Harwell had told him about her plan standing by his horse on a warm afternoon in September, that felt like it belonged to a different world. Cyrus Fenton asked himself a question he had not previously allowed himself to consider. What if she was right? He did not answer it. He turned over and closed his eyes and listened to the wind and did not sleep for a long time. The days shortened and shortened again the way they do in that part of the world, where winter does not proceed in a straight line but in a kind of jagged rhythm, cold and colder, and briefly less cold and then colder still, each cycle ratcheting the temperature down in steps that feel like the land is making a decision slowly about how much it is willing to take from the people who live on it. March arrived. The first days of March were cold but unremarkable. The kind of cold that late winter produces as a matter of course, expected and endured. But toward the end of the first week, something changed. The temperature began dropping in a way that felt different from ordinary cold. Not the sharp, clear cold of a bright winter day, the kind of cold that hurts but also has a certain beauty to it, the way a blade has beauty. This was a heavy, pressing cold that came with a sky the color of old iron, and winds that did not gust so much as simply lean against everything steady and relentless, as if the air itself had decided to lie down on the land and not get up. The Halverson boy, who sometimes helped drive cattle for Cyrus Fenton on the weekends, said later that the horses would not settle the afternoon before it hit, just walked their stalls in circles and would not eat. Animals know things that people have to be told. Old Gertrude Blanchard told anyone who would listen that she had seen her sheep pack themselves into the corner of the barn that morning in a way she had only seen once before years ago in Minnesota, right before the worst storm she had ever experienced. Maggie stood outside her house on the afternoon before the storm and looked at the sky. She had seen bad weather on the prairie. She had seen cold that made the world feel hostile and wind that made it feel abandoned. But the sky that afternoon was something she had not seen before. It was not merely gray, it was heavy. It pressed downward like a ceiling being lowered by the slow turning of some enormous mechanism, and the light beneath it was the color of a bruised yellow and gray and faintly green at the edges, the kind of light that makes familiar things look strange and strange things look inevitable. She went inside. She checked the tunnel entry in the root cellar. Sound, she checked the timber supports in the first section. Solid, she had Clara help her carry extra feed down into the passage and stack it near the barn entrance so she would not need to handle heavy loads in the tunnel itself. She filled every water container in the house. She stacked firewood inside by the stove enough for 3 days. She did not know it would be 3 days. She simply prepared for the worst she could imagine and hoped it would be enough. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. Clara was reading to Samuel from a book of stories that had belonged to Thomas when he was a boy. The book was worn soft at the spine from years of handling, and some of the pages had been repaired with paste that had yellowed with age, and Maggie could see Thomas's fingerprints on the cover, or imagine she could faint impressions left by hands that had held this book when they were small and that had later built a barn and adjusted a harness and pressed against a chest where something had gone wrong inside. The wind outside was building, not yet the full voice of what was coming, but the first notes of it low and sustained the sound of something gathering itself. Maggie opened her journal and wrote 3 words. It is coming. She closed the book. She checked the stove. She looked at her grandchildren one more time. Clara's dark head bent over the book, Samuel leaning against her shoulder with his eyes half closed, and she felt something that she recognized from the bottom step of the root cellar 3 years ago. not certainty, something adjacent to certainty. The feeling of having done what could be done and of knowing that what she had done was the right thing and of understanding that the proof of it was about to arrive, whether she was ready for it or not. The storm came before midnight. By the following morning, the world outside was simply gone. Not hidden, not obscured, gone. Replaced by a moving white wall that drove snow horizontal with a sound less like wind and more like a sustained note played on some enormous instrument, a single chord held without pause or variation, hour after hour until it stopped being a sound at all and became the texture of the air itself. You did not hear it after a while. You felt it. In your teeth. In the boards of the floor beneath your feet. In the vibration of the glass in the windows which Maggie had stuffed with rags and sealed with candle wax, and which still trembled in their frames as if the house itself was shivering. The cold that accompanied the wind was something beyond what the word cold is designed to describe. It was not a temperature. It was a force. It worked through the walls the way water works through stone, not quickly, but inevitably finding every gap, every imperfection, every place where the chinking had dried or the wood had contracted, and it pressed inward with a patience that felt deliberate. The stove burned steady and hot, fed with the wood Maggie had stacked inside the night before, and still the far corners of the house held a chill that made Samuel pull his blanket around himself and press closer to Claire on the bed. Maggie rose before dawn. Though dawn was a theoretical concept that morning, the sky showing no discernible difference between night and day, only gradations of gray that shifted from dark to slightly less dark and back again as the storm moved in waves across the plain. She dressed, she checked the stove, she made a thin porridge for the children from oats she had stored in the kitchen, and she sat with them while they ate, and she listened to the storm and said nothing about it because there was nothing useful to say. Then she walked to the root cellar and descended the steps and entered the tunnel. The sound changed immediately. The sustained roar of the wind above which had become so constant that she had stopped consciously hearing it was replaced by silence. Not perfect silence. She could hear the muffled presence of the storm above her, a distant humming in the packed earth overhead, the way you can hear rain from inside a deep room. But the violence of it was gone. The air in the passage was still. It was cool, and it did not move, and it did not bite, and it did not try to take anything from her. She walked to the barn in her house clothes. Wool dress, apron, leather shoes, lantern in her right hand, the flame steady and undisturbed by any draft. She walked the way a woman walks down a hallway to check on a sleeping child, unhurried upright, breathing normally. 40 strides to the silo, another stretch to the barn. She emerged into the partitioned space she had built at the tunnel's terminus, pushed open the low wooden door, and stepped into the barn. The animals looked at her. The cows turned their heavy heads. The horses shifted in their stalls. The pigs grunted from their corner and went back to rooting at their feed trough. The chickens clucked from their partitioned section, doing what chickens do, regardless of the weather, which is everything chickens always do. None of the animals showed distress. None showed the wild-eyed look that animals get when they are being pushed to the edge of what their bodies can sustain. They were calm. They were eating. They were simply being animals, which was all she had ever wanted for them. She fed them. She watered them from the supply she kept in the barn, which had not frozen because the barn connected now to the passage beneath it, held a temperature that stayed above freezing, even when the air outside was something that would kill an exposed person in less than an hour. She checked the hay supply. She checked the timber supports where the tunnel entered the barn, running her hand along the joints, feeling for any shift or give. Everything held. The ground held. The structure held. She walked back through the tunnel to the house, hung up the lantern, and made a note in her journal. Day 1. Animals fed and watered. Passage sound. No exposure to outside conditions. Claire and Samuel warm. She wrote a line to Thomas beneath it. You were right about the prairie dogs. The storm ran for 3 days. Not 3 days of blizzard exactly, but 3 days in which the conditions outside made any time spent above ground not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous. The wind did not stop. It shifted direction twice, coming first from the northwest, and then swinging around to the north, and then back again. Each shift bringing a new wave of cold that layered itself on top of what was already there, pressing down with increasing weight, until the air itself seemed to have substance, to be not just cold, but dense, heavy, a physical thing you would have to push through if you were foolish enough to go out into it. Maggie made the trip through the tunnel 3 times each day, morning, midday, evening. She carried feed and water through the passage with the ease of a woman walking to her kitchen. She checked the animals with the calm attention she had always given them, and she returned to the house without having felt the wind once, without having opened the front door once, without having lost a single degree of the warmth her stove had built. On the first evening, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and listened to the storm. It was louder now than it had been that morning, the wind having found new ways to work itself against the house, new angles of attack that produced new sounds, whistles and moans, and the occasional sharp crack of a tree branch surrendering somewhere in the distance. She held her coffee cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it and thought about Cyrus Fenton 2 miles north, making his fourth chirrup of the day, from his house to his barn and back, wrapped in every layer he owned, leaning into a wind that did not care how many layers he wore. She thought about Gertrude Blanchard 3 miles south, and Gertrude's son trudging through the snow to tend the sheep, and she thought about the Halversons and old Henrik standing at his barn door with the wind cutting through him, while Eric struggled to close it against a gust that treated the door like a sail. She thought about all of them doing what they had always done, what their parents had done, what everyone had always done, and she sat in her warm kitchen with her coffee cup and her journal, and the tunnel running quiet and steady beneath her feet, and she did not feel vindication. She felt sadness, a heavy, settled sadness for the stubbornness that keeps people suffering in ways they do not have to suffer simply because the suffering is familiar and the alternative is not. On the second day, just past noon, Maggie heard a sound she did not expect. Someone was knocking on her door. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the door, and for a moment did not move. No one should have been outside. No one with any sense would have attempted the trip from any of the neighboring homesteads to hers in these conditions. The distance alone made it dangerous. The wind and cold made it something closer to suicidal. She opened the door. Cyrus Fenton stood on her porch. He was covered in frost. Not the light dusting that forms on a man's beard during a short walk in cold weather, but a thick, heavy coating that covered his eyebrows and his mustache and the front of his coat and the tops of his boots, the kind of frost that only forms on a person who has been outside for a very long time in very bad conditions. His face beneath the frost was the color of old candle wax, gray and yellowish, and his eyes had the particular expression that Maggie had seen once before years ago on the face of a man in Ohio who had fallen through river ice and been pulled out by his companions. The expression of a person who has been taken somewhere they did not intend to go and is not entirely sure all of themselves has come back. He did not speak immediately. He stood on the porch and looked at her, and his mouth moved once before any sound came out. "2 of my hogs," he said. His voice was hoarse as if the cold had worked its way into his throat and roughened everything it touched. "2 of my hogs died in the night. I lost feeling in 2 fingers on my right hand making the trip between the house and the barn this morning." He held up his right hand. The index finger and the middle finger were white, not pink, not red, white, the color of something from which the blood has retreated entirely and is not sure it wants to return. Maggie looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked past him into the storm which was still driving snow across the yard in sheets that made the barn invisible, though it was no more than 60 feet away. The cold that came through the open door hit her like a wall, and as she felt in that single moment in the contrast between the air inside and the air outside, the full measure of what her tunnel had given her and what its absence had cost the man standing in front of her. He was not asking for anything specific. He was not requesting shelter or aid or any particular form of help. He was, she understood, simply at the end of something. He had reached a place in his experience that he had not been to before, a place where the things he knew how to do were no longer sufficient, where the methods that had been passed down from his father and his grandfather and all the men before them who had faced bad weather and survived it through sheer endurance had been tested and found wanting. He was standing on her porch because her porch was the nearest place that was not failing. She brought him inside. She sat him by the stove. She pulled off his gloves and looked at his fingers more closely, holding them in her own hands, which were warm from the house, and she felt the waxy stiffness in them that meant the flesh was frozen but perhaps not yet dead. She wrapped them in a cloth she had warmed by the stove and told him to hold them still and let the heat do its work. She made coffee. The same thin coffee stretched further than the grounds deserved, but hot. She set it in front of him and watched him try to lift the cup with his left hand because his right hand was wrapped and useless. And she saw the way his jaw tightened when the heat of the cup hit his palm, the involuntary flinch of a body that has forgotten what warmth feels like and is not sure it trusts it. She sat across from him and waited. She did not ask questions. She did not offer commentary. She waited the way she had waited for children in her classroom who had arrived upset and needed time before they could speak, the way a good teacher waits, with presence and patience and without pressure. The color came back into his face slowly, not all at once, but in stages: gray, becoming pink, becoming something that looked like life again. His hands stopped moving in that involuntary way, that restless flexing and unflexing that people do when they are trying to convince themselves that everything still works, that the body they have relied on for 50 years has not betrayed them in some permanent way. After a while, when he had finished the coffee and she had poured him another cup and the shaking had mostly stopped, she asked him if he wanted to see the tunnel. He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were clear now, the shock receding, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the beginning of something else, something that had been building behind his skepticism for months, pressing against it the way the cold pressed against the walls, quietly and without stopping. He said yes. She led him to the root cellar, down the steps past the shelves of preserved food, past the jars of beans and the crocks of salted pork, to the opening she had cut in the back wall. She lit a lantern and ducked through the entrance, and he followed her, and she heard the moment he felt it. It was not a sound, it was a cessation of sound. The storm, which had been a constant presence, even inside the house, a low vibration that you felt more than heard, disappeared. The air in the passage was still and cool and utterly calm, unchanged by the catastrophe taking place above, holding steady the way it had held steady since October. She heard Cyrus exhale behind her. A long, slow breath, the kind of breath a person releases when a pain they have been carrying is suddenly and unexpectedly lifted. She walked him through the passage. She did not speak. She let the tunnel speak for itself, the way she would have let a well-prepared lesson speak for itself in her classroom in Ohio, trusting the evidence to do what argument could not. He put his hand against the earthen wall at one point and held it there, and she saw his fingers, the ones that still had feeling, press into the packed dirt, testing the temperature, the way you test bath water, carefully and with attention. They emerged into the barn. His animals 2 miles north were dying or dead. Her animals stood in their stalls in relative calm, eating steadily, breathing easily. The cows chewed their cud. The horses stood with their heads low, resting their coats smooth and unruffled, their ribs well covered. The pigs rooted at their straw with the unhurried contentment of animals that had no idea a storm was happening, because in this barn, connected to the ground by a passage that held the earth's own temperature, the storm was happening somewhere else. It was happening to other people and other animals and other barns, but not to these, and the difference was visible in every calm eye and every full belly and every unbothered breath. Cyrus Fenton stood in that barn for a long time without saying anything. Maggie watched his face and saw something move through it that she recognized because she had felt it herself 3 years ago on the bottom step of the root cellar. The shift. The moment when something you thought you understood rearranges itself into a different shape, and you realize that the new shape was always there waiting for you to see it, and that the only thing preventing you from seeing it was the assumption that you already knew what you were looking at. He said quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way of a man making a statement of fact in front of a witness, that he had been wrong about this. Maggie nodded. He said he had lost 2 hogs. She said she knew. She said she was sorry. He said his wife Martha had cried over it. Not for sentiment. Martha Fenton was not a sentimental woman. She had cried because those hogs represented months of feed and care and planning, and because losing them in March meant starting over in spring with less than they needed, and because the mathematics of that loss would follow them into the next winter and the winter after that in ways that could not be easily corrected. Maggie said she understood that too. He looked around the barn one more time, at the calm horses, at the cows, at the pigs that were simply going about being pigs, eating and grunting and rooting at their straw with the complete indifference of animals that have no idea anything unusual is happening in the world above them. Then he looked at the tunnel entrance, the dark opening in the wall through which they had come. The passage that led back beneath the frozen earth to the house where his coffee was growing cold on the table. He shook his head once slowly, not in denial, but in the particular way a man shakes his head when he is reckoning with the distance between what he believed and what is true, and finding that the distance is larger than he would like. They walked back through the tunnel together in silence. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The wind did not stop gradually. It stopped the way a held note stops when the player lifts the bow abruptly and completely, leaving behind a silence that felt almost louder than the sound had been. The sky did not clear. It remained gray and heavy and low, but the driving snow ceased and the temperature, though still brutal, lost the killing edge it had carried for 72 hours. Maggie stepped outside for the first time in 3 days. The world was white and still and utterly changed. Snow had drifted against the north wall of the barn to a height that nearly reached the eaves. The fence posts along the road were buried. The road itself had disappeared, erased by 3 days of wind-driven accumulation, and in its place was a smooth, unbroken plain of white that stretched in every direction without feature or interruption, as if the land had been wiped clean and returned to something prior to human occupation. The silence after the storm was enormous, the kind of silence that has weight that sits on the landscape, the way the snow sits on the ground, pressing everything flat. Maggie stood on her porch and breathed the cold air, which was sharp but no longer violent. And she looked at the world the storm had made, and she thought about the world beneath it, the quiet passage running under the snow from house to silo to barn, the ground holding its temperature with the same indifference it had held it through the worst of the storm, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 days. Relief, not triumph, not satisfaction, relief. The deep bone-level relief of a woman who had bet everything on an idea that everyone around her said was wrong, and who now knew with the certainty of experience rather than theory that the idea was right. The cleanup took weeks, the damage was extensive, and it was not distributed evenly. 3 families in the broader area lost livestock they could not afford to lose. The Halverson family lost 4 cattle and a horse. The horse had been their best, a strong young mare that Henrik had traded for the previous summer, and losing her set them back in ways that would take 2 full seasons to recover from. Cyrus Fenton, in addition to his 2 hogs, lost a milk cow that had been healthy the morning the storm arrived and was dead by the morning it ended. She had frozen standing up in the corner of his barn where the wind had found its way through a gap in the chinking that Cyrus had patched 3 times and that had opened again in the cold. Gertrude Blanchard's sheep survived, but her son had developed a cough during the storm that would not leave him for months, the kind of deep, wet cough that people on the frontier recognized as the first sign of something they did not have a reliable name for, but knew was serious. And then there was the news about Silas Crenshaw. Silas was an older man who lived alone on a small property farther north beyond Cyrus Fenton's place in a section of the territory that was even more isolated than the area where Maggie and her neighbors had settled. He was known in the way that solitary people are known in sparse communities, not well but consistently a presence on the edge of awareness, who was accounted for at intervals and otherwise left to his own devices. He raised a few cattle, kept a kitchen garden in the summer, and came to the occasional gathering at the Fenton place with a quietness about him that people interpreted as either shyness or preference, and never asked about directly. He had no family nearby. He had no tunnel. He had a house and a barn separated by 40 feet of open ground, the same arrangement that every homesteader in the territory maintained, and he had faced the storm the way every homesteader before him had faced every storm, by wrapping himself in everything he owned and walking out into it. He had made it to the barn. They found him there. He was sitting against the interior wall with his coat pulled around him and his hat still on his head, as if he had sat down to rest for a moment before making the return trip and had simply not gotten up. The cold had taken him sometime during the first night, or perhaps the second. No one could say exactly when. It did not matter exactly when. What mattered was that he had died in the space between his house and his barn. Not in the barn itself, though that was where they found him. He had died in the decision to cross that distance, in the ordinary act of going out to tend his animals, the way he had always gone out to tend his animals, the way everyone went out, the way it had always been done. 40 feet. The same distance Maggie walked 3 times a day through a tunnel that kept her warm and safe and alive. 40 feet that Silas Crenshaw had walked above ground in the wind, the way it had always been done, because no one had ever shown him that there was another way. Maggie heard the news from Cyrus, who came by a week after the storm, to tell her and to sit at her table again, and to look at her with an expression that was different from any expression he had worn in her presence before. It was the expression of a man who is recalculating. Not just the tunnel, not just the method, but the entire framework of assumption that had led him to dismiss it and the cost of that dismissal, which now had a name and a face and a body sitting against a barn wall with its hat still on. He did not say that Silas would have lived if he had built a tunnel. He did not need to. The arithmetic was plain enough. It sat between them on the kitchen table like something solid, something with edges, and neither of them touched it because touching it would have required saying things that were too large for the room they were sitting in. For Maggie Harwell's homestead, the accounting of that storm was different. Her animals had come through in better condition than they had entered January. She had not lost a single one, not a hog, not a calf, not a chicken. Her children had not missed a single day of warmth or stability because of the weather. Her woodpile, when she measured it against what she had expected to use by this point in the season, still had close to a third of the winter's supply remaining. She had not set foot outside her buildings for the worst 3 days of the worst winter in recent memory, and everything that needed tending had been tended. She did not say any of this to Cyrus. She did not need to. He had walked the tunnel, he had seen the barn. He had stood among her animals and felt the air and touched the wall, and he knew. And now he knew about Silas, and that knowledge had given the tunnel a dimension it had not had before. It was no longer merely a convenience or an improvement. It was the difference between living and dying, and that difference was no longer theoretical. It had a name. The March of 1892 became the measure against which cold was judged 4 years to come in that part of the territory. A reference point in conversation. Not as bad as the March of '92, or worse than anything since '92. People spoke of it the way people speak of floods and fires, as a thing that divided time into before and after a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Cyrus Fenton came back in April after the ground had softened enough to work. He stood in her yard with his hat in his hands, which was something he did when he was about to say something that cost him, and Maggie knew before he spoke what he was going to ask, because she had been waiting for it not with impatience, but with the quiet confidence of a teacher who has set a lesson in motion and is waiting for the student to arrive at the answer on his own. He told her that he was thinking of digging a shorter version of the same system. Just barn to house, nothing as ambitious as what she had built, but the same idea, the same principle. And he asked in the careful way of a man who is aware that he is asking a favor of someone he once doubted, whether she would be willing to walk him through what she had learned. She said she would be glad to. She said it without triumph, without vindication, without any of the satisfaction that a lesser person might have felt in that moment standing in her yard in the April sun with the man who had told the Halversons she had lost her good sense now asking her to teach him. She said it the way a teacher says it because that is what she was, a teacher, and teachers do not gloat when the student finally understands. They simply begin the next lesson. She walked him through the tunnel again this time, with her journal pointing out the construction details she had worked out, the depth, the width, the timbering method, the clay and straw sealant, the way to notch the support beams, the trick of wetting the ground the night before digging. She gave him everything she had learned, every small discovery, every failed attempt, and its correction, because that is what teachers do. They do not hoard what they know. They give it away freely and completely, because the purpose of knowledge is not to be possessed, but to be used. Cyrus listened the way he had not listened before, with attention that was no longer competing with skepticism, attention that was simply attention, the full weight of a capable mind directed at a problem it now understood was worth solving. He asked questions, good ones, practical ones, the kind of questions a man asks when he is already building the thing in his mind and wants to make sure the foundation is right. Maggie answered each one from the notes in her journal, and Cyrus nodded, and she could see the plan taking shape behind his eyes, the way she used to see understanding take shape behind the eyes of a child who has finally grasped a difficult concept. Eric Halverson, who heard about the conversation through the small network of information that moves between isolated homesteads in ways that no one can entirely trace, rode over one afternoon and asked to see the tunnel himself. He did not grin when he asked. He did not make jokes about wasting a good autumn. He asked the way a man asks who has lost 4 cattle and a horse and has spent a winter wondering whether there might have been a way to prevent it. Maggie led him through the tunnel end to end, and he walked the full length of it in silence. She watched him the way she had watched Cyrus, looking for the moment of shift, the moment when the evidence overtook the assumption, and she saw it happen in the passage between the silo and the house when Eric put his hand against the earthen wall and held it there and felt what the ground had to offer. When he came back out into the daylight, he said nothing directly about having laughed at the project 2 autumns before. He did not apologize. Men like Eric Halverson, young men on the frontier who have built their sense of themselves around competence and certainty, do not apologize easily, and Maggie did not expect him to. What he did was ask her whether the timbering had given her any trouble in the spring thaw. She told him about the one section that had needed reinforcement after the first melt and showed him what she had done about it. He nodded and paid attention in a way he clearly meant as acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement, offered quietly and without fanfare, was worth more to Maggie than any apology would have been. By the autumn of 1893, 3 properties in that part of the territory had underground passage systems of some kind connecting their buildings. None were exactly like Maggie's. Each was adapted to its own geography and needs its own distances and soil conditions, and the particular arrangement of structures that each homestead had evolved over the years. Cyrus's ran straight from house to barn, a simple passage that Martha had insisted be wide enough for her to walk upright. The Halversons built a longer system that connected their house to both the cattle barn and the horse stable, with a branch that Henrik had added on his own initiative, leading to the root cellar he used for storing vegetables. But all of them drew directly from what Maggie had worked out alone 2 autumns before, with a mattock and a spade and a leather journal, and the memory of standing in a root cellar and feeling something that everyone around her had access to feeling, but that only she had stopped to think about long enough to act on. Gertrude Blanchard, who had worried aloud about cave-ins and sent polite notes suggesting that Maggie reconsider, sent her son over with a basket of preserves and a note saying she was glad the idea had proven out. It was the closest thing to an apology that anyone offered, and Maggie took it in the spirit intended. She set the preserves on the shelf next to the jar Gertrude had sent 2 years before, the one that had come with the note suggesting she might benefit from assistance thinking through her plans, and she looked at the 2 jars sitting side by side, and she allowed herself a small, private smile that no one was present to see. The tunnel system she built that autumn served her family for the rest of their time on that property. She remarried in 1896 a man named Albert Cross, who had come from Pennsylvania. He was a quiet man, 5 years younger than Maggie, practical and observant, with the particular intelligence of a person who watches more than he speaks and who draws conclusions from what he sees rather than from what he is told. Maggie told Clara years later that what she had valued most about Albert was that he had enough sense to recognize a good idea when he saw one already built. He had not asked her to explain it. He had not asked her to justify it. He had walked the tunnel on his first visit to the property, felt the air, looked at the animals, and nodded, and that nod had told her more about his character than any conversation could have. It was the nod of a man who understood things by touching them, by standing in them, by letting the evidence speak. The nod of a man who did not need to be convinced because he trusted his own senses more than he trusted other people's opinions. Maggie had spent 5 years surrounded by people who trusted other people's opinions more than their own senses. And Albert's nod was, in its quiet way, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. The passage was expanded twice afterward, extended to include a small outbuilding Albert used for equipment storage, and the original barn section was retimbered when the cottonwood logs began to show their age, replaced with oak that Albert had hauled from a stand of timber 20 miles to the east. The system grew the way good systems grow, not through grand redesign, but through the steady accumulation of small improvements, each one building on what came before, each one making the whole thing a little more durable, a little more useful, a little more permanent. Clara, who grew up walking that tunnel with a lantern on winter mornings, later recalled in a letter to her own children that the passage had felt like moving through the inside of something alive, the ground holding its warmth steady and unhurried, indifferent to whatever the sky above was doing. She said she had never felt afraid in the tunnel, not once, even as a child. She said it had felt safe in a way that was different from the safety of the house, which depended on walls and fire and constant human effort. The tunnel's safety came from the ground itself. It was not something that had to be maintained. It simply was. Samuel, who had carried water to his grandmother in half-full buckets at the age of 5, and who had grown up never knowing what it was like to walk through a blizzard to reach the barn, became a farmer himself in the eastern part of the territory. He built his own tunnel system on his own property, and when people asked him where he had learned it, he said he had learned it from his grandmother, and he said it with a pride that Clara, who was present the first time he said it, reported made her eyes sting in a way that had nothing to do with the dust. The property was eventually sold in 1921 after Albert and Maggie had moved to the eastern part of the state to be closer to Clara's family. Maggie was 92 years old by then, or close to it, and her hands still showed the marks of the digging she had done 30 years before the calluses long softened. But the shape of them still visible, the way the shape of hard work remains in a body long after the work itself is finished. She lived 3 more years, dying in the winter of 1924, in a warm house with her family around her, having survived every winter that the plains had thrown at her and having built the means for others to survive them too. A section of the original passage was still in use as a root storage area as late as the 1930s, according to a letter Clara wrote to her own children, long past the time when anyone thought of it as something remarkable, because the remarkable had become the ordinary the way the best ideas eventually do. They start as something that draws stares and laughter and polite notes of concern, and they end as something so obvious that no one can remember what it was like before they existed. That is the arc of every good idea. Ridicule, resistance, adoption, invisibility. The final stage, the stage where the idea disappears into the background of daily life and is no longer noticed at all, is not a failure of memory. It is the highest compliment an idea can receive. It means the idea has become part of the world. There is something worth sitting with in the story of what Margaret Harwell did in the autumn of 1891. She was not an engineer. She had no formal training in construction or agriculture or geology or any of the disciplines that might have told her in technical terms what the ground beneath her feet was capable of. She had a journal, a mattock, a spade, 2 months of October and November before the ground froze solid. She had the memory of standing in a root cellar on a cold day in 1888 and feeling something that everyone around her had access to feeling, but that only she had stopped to think about long enough to act on. The community that doubted her was not composed of foolish people. Cyrus Fenton was a competent man, a good rancher, a reliable neighbor who showed up when fences needed mending and who checked on people when the weather turned bad. The Halversons were capable farmers who would go on to build one of the more successful homesteads in that part of the territory. Gertrude Blanchard had survived more hard winters than most people will ever see. They were not fools. They had simply made the mistake that intelligent people make more often than they like to admit, which is to assume that the way things have always been done is the way things should always be done, and to mistake the absence of a better method for proof that no better method exists. What Maggie had that they did not have, at least not in that moment, was the willingness to take a familiar observation and follow it somewhere that felt foolish to follow. That is a particular kind of courage that is easy to underestimate because it does not look like courage from the outside. From the outside, it looks like stubbornness, or eccentricity, or a woman past 60 who has been alone too long and has gotten peculiar ideas about what the ground can do. The March storm was what changed the appearance of things. Events have a way of doing that, of clarifying in the most direct possible terms whether an idea was foolish or merely unfamiliar. Maggie had needed no validation before the storm. She had the journal and the improving condition of her animals and the warmth of her house, and she knew what those things meant. But the storm gave the validation a shape that other people could stand in and feel for themselves. And that mattered, because change in a community does not happen through argument. It happens through felt experience, through standing in a barn full of calm animals while your own animals are dying 2 miles away, through touching an earthen wall and feeling the temperature of the ground and understanding in your body rather than your mind that the woman you doubted was right. What frontier people understood in ways that we have perhaps partly forgotten is that the answers to hard problems are often already present in the environment, waiting, in the temperature of the ground, in the behavior of animals, in the way a root cellar feels different from the air above it. The knowledge was not hidden, it was not secret. It required only observation and patience and the willingness to be considered a fool for long enough to find out whether the observation was right. Margaret Harwell was right. She knew she was right before the storm proved it. And she dug anyway in the cold alone for 2 months at 62 years old, with hands that bled and a back that seized and knees that ached and two grandchildren sleeping in a narrow bed who were the only reason she needed to keep swinging the mattock into the ground. She dug because that was what it took. She dug because no one was coming to help. She dug because the ground had told her something true and she had listened, and listening was not enough. You had to act. You had to get down on your knees in the dirt and do the work that the knowledge required, even when the work was brutal and the people around you thought you had lost your mind. If this kind of history speaks to something in you, if you find yourself wanting to know more about the men and women who solved the problems of frontier life through ingenuity and sheer persistence, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. There are more stories like Maggie's, many of them just as specific and just as human, waiting to be told. Subscribing means you will be here when they are. Leaving a comment, especially if you have a story from your own family's history that echoes what Maggie did, keeps these voices in conversation with each other across time. And that, in the end, is how the memory of people like Margaret Harwell stays alive. Not in archives or textbooks, but in communities of people who believed these lives were worth remembering. They were. She was. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives in the ground itself, patient and constant, available to anyone willing to get down on their knees and pay attention. Margaret Harwell paid attention. She built something from it, and long after the last timber of her tunnel rotted back into the earth that had held it for decades, the idea remained. Carried forward in the hands of every homesteader who ever laid a passage beneath the frost line and felt for the first time how different the world becomes when you stop fighting the cold and start working with what the ground has always been quietly offering.